All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this live stream. A little bit of Q&A. Going to be giving some feedback on some student examples and also I'm going to be taking some questions. So any questions that you have, I know that right now is quite a busy assessment period for a lot of you. So if you have been given some exam questions or assessment questions that you want to talk about, that you want to discuss, that you want to get feedback for, now is the time to ask. So I'm going to be on this live stream for the next 45 minutes to an hour. So please ask away. What's up, Jack? Thanks for standing by. Hope you're doing well. How is the term going? When are you finished, Jack, in terms of school? Some schools are finishing next week. Some schools still have 2 to 3 weeks to go. So probably still quite a few assessments that are taking place right now. So feel free to let me know where you're at with your assessments. What are you studying at the moment? How's the term going? Put something into the chat. Let me know that you can hear me, that everything's coming through okay for you. Jack finishing in a couple of weeks. That's cool. Well, hopefully the term's been going well for you. Have you already finished your assessment, Jack? Have you moved on to something else? What are you looking at the moment? I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes before I get into some feedback. And then I've got a couple of responses that I'm going to go through. So bear with me here while we get a few more people in the room, in the live stream. Got my English assessment next week for 1984. All right. Do you have any specific questions about that, Jack? Were you one of the ones who submitted a question? I can see a question now. So let's go through that. Question from Jack is, do I have any ideas on, in Orwell's context, some ways that governments limited individuality? Absolutely. There's a ton. I mean, if you're looking at 1984, let's start super broad. So let's zoom out of the context. The book was published, the novel, I should say, was published in 1949, right? So he's writing at around 1948. What is that period? Well, the Second World War has just finished, which means Hitler only just went out of power, and we just had the Holocaust. So we had the Nazi regime. We've got lots of totalitarian leaders emerging, lots of fascists. So you've got fascism typified by Hitler in terms of Nazi Germany. So we've had all of that just happen when Orwell is writing this text. We've got Stalin. He's really the big one. He's the big guy that you need to be talking about because Stalin's still in power at this time in Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union. Okay. For some periods, it was actually called Soviet Russia. Other times it's called the Soviet Union. It's not called just Russia at that period of time. Okay. We now call it Russia, but you could call it Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union, depending on what specific time frame you're looking at. But around the period of Orwell's writing for 1984, we were looking at the rise of Stalin and the fact that across the Soviet Union, the USSR, he is basically a totalitarian leader who is massively oppressing the population of the Soviet Union. Okay, so countries that we now know as Russia, Ukraine, all of those areas are subjected to massive oppression under Stalin, who is a totalitarian leader, just like Hitler was for Nazi Germany. So there's another totalitarian leader, but in different ways. And we also have communism starting to spread. Those ideas are starting to spread, actually right around the time of publication. So you wouldn't necessarily talk about China becoming communist. I think that was 1949, Mao Zedong, 1949. But certainly around that period, and especially after the Second World War, you've got a lot of anxiety about communism starting to spread around the world. This is the start of the Cold War. So that post-war period, we say post-war for post-World War II, but after World War II, you have the Cold War begin. I think Orwell was one of the guys who actually coined that term, Cold War. But from around 1945 up until, say, 1991, or some say 1990, 1989, around that period, 45 years, more or less, you've got the Cold War, which is a massive tension between America, who represent democracy and freedom and voting your own government in. And if you don't like the way that someone is governing the country, you can vote them out. Okay, that's democracy. You've got capitalism. You've got people determining their own fates. People have the ability to make money and get rich. Or you have Stalin and you have his system, communism, where you don't have that power. You don't have power to decide who's going to govern you because you don't get a vote. You're completely brainwashed. They control how much money you earn and how much money you make. They control all the information that you see. So what you want to be talking about in terms of limiting individuality in Orwell's context is the way that totalitarianism had been spread in across the world, but in particular across Europe because of Nazi Germany with Hitler's reign, and now Stalin in Soviet Russia or across the Soviet Union, I would say, because it also impacted places that we now know as Ukraine. So the USSR or the Soviet Union under Stalin, you've also got Hitler for Nazi Germany, and then we can look at now all the ways that they were limiting individuality. So with all of that context in mind, how was Stalin limiting individuality? Well, he was censoring what people could read and what they could watch. So the media was all censored. People were being told that something was a reality that in fact was not a reality. So the truth was being manipulated in newspapers, right? That would be like us being told literally just blatant lies in the newspaper because the government wanted us to believe that something happened. So stories were being made up in the media because the government wanted to convince people and brainwash people into thinking that it was a great government and the government was serving them well. And it didn't want them to know about what was really going on and the fact that they were being told lies in order to maintain power. So censorship is a massive way that governments were limiting individuality because it was controlling and manipulating how people were thinking. Okay, so it's very important when you think about individuality that you think about it in terms of thoughts and actions, what you're allowed to do, what you're allowed to think, what you're allowed to say, okay? Freedom of expression was massively impacted. It was inhibited. It was stifled. That's good language to use in an essay, okay? Freedom of expression was stifled under Stalin, under these totalitarian systems of government, because if you spoke out against the government, that was obviously going to represent a threat to the government. It means that Stalin might lose his power if everyone starts challenging him and questioning what he's doing. So because he wanted to abuse his power, because he didn't have a good intent, he didn't want to use power for the good of his people. He didn't want to empower his people to be free. He wanted to control everything they did. Because he was insecure about losing that power, that meant he had to manipulate how people thought. And to manipulate how people think, you need to control the information that they're exposed to. So to control the information that they're exposed to, you need to control the media and what is being said in newspapers. You need to control things like the internet, right? Like if you think about North Korea, they don't even have the internet. They don't even know what's going on here. They don't even know that Australia exists, probably in a lot of cases, right? So these people are being brainwashed into thinking that their country is the ultimate country, that Big Brother or Stalin is the ultimate leader, so that they don't question or challenge their authority, because they know that if they get challenged, they don't have a good response because they're not serving those people's best interests. Okay, so censorship is a massive one in terms of controlling individuality, but also what ties to censorship is surveillance. So if you want to feed people lies, that's propaganda. So propaganda, censorship, control what people see. Propaganda is control how people think. We want everyone to be patriotic and love Stalin or love Big Brother. Okay, we'll make sure we do things that are going to encourage that kind of patriotism, and we're going to stop people from thinking clearly and critically about what we're doing. And then there's surveillance, right? So there's actually watching people, which we know Big Brother is iconic for, right? Big Brother is always watching. Well, Stalin was always watching. He had people on the ground, spies. Those things existed as well. Okay, so surveillance and spies were a real thing. Propaganda, I'll give you another specific example as well. One thing that was banned under Soviet laws was pornography. So you can look that up. So don't look up pornography. Look up how Stalin banned pornography, right? So pornography was actually banned under Soviet law. okay? Because again, Stalin, like any totalitarian leader, wants to control how you behave and think. So he doesn't want to expose you to things that are going to basically awaken any kind of primal desires, primal motivations and urges, anything sexual. Big Brother wants you to be completely devoted to it, to the government. And to be completely devoted, they want to break down the family unit. They want to break down your biological impulses so that they can completely manipulate it. Okay, so the outlawing of pornography, very good specific example under Stalin, if you're talking about 1984. Another good example is under Hitler. They actually had the Hitler Youth. So if you look up the Hitler Youth, you're going to see an example of a totalitarian leader, in this case Hitler, actually breaking down the family unit by turning all of the younger generations into spies, so much so that they would even potentially turn in their own parents. And that's what you see with the Parsons family in 1984. So breaking down the familial unit, right? Breaking down that family unit, those familial connections, is a key way to atomize the collective. And to atomize the collective is to kind of convert the whole population into these small atoms. They're all isolated atoms, and they're not that powerful as long as they remain as isolated atoms. If they come together, like a family can come together, then that represents a threat to the government, because now you've got collective power. But if you keep everyone on their toes and turned against one another, even within the family unit, then that's a really powerful way to control a population. Okay, you want to ensure that there is not going to be a large resistance. So you want to dumb down your population. You want to break down their loyalty. You want to completely manipulate the knowledge that they're exposed to, so that they don't feel like they're being oppressed. Right? Ignorance is bliss. That's what we see in 1984. And there are some really good examples. Hopefully that helps you with that. Another example, actually, just before I move on from the point, because this history is really fascinating. I'm one of those guys who enjoys history more through the context of literature. So if we look at a text like 1984, to me, that's an amazing gateway or portal into understanding the history of a particular era. So when you look at 1984, you'll also see that they had, or they have, the Ministry of Plenty, which is ironic because the Ministry of Plenty is actually designed, its function is to actually reduce and control the amount of food that people have access to. So the Ministry of Plenty is all about ensuring that there remains a level of scarcity, ironically, in the society, right? They don't want there to be too much food. They don't want there to be too much wealth. Because if people have too much of these things, they're not going to be desperate. And as Maslow's hierarchy of needs tells us, if people are obsessed about where they're getting their next meal, then they won't be thinking about challenging the government. They won't be thinking about their freedom. There's a hierarchy of needs. And as individuals, if we don't have basic needs like food, water, shelter, then we can't even contemplate the next level of needs, which is autonomy, individuality. So individuality is second to your more basic primal needs, survival needs really, such as food and water. So you have the Ministry of Plenty, which is a ministry of Big Brother, which is designed to ensure that people never have those basic needs satisfied. Otherwise, they can jump up and start thinking about their freedom and thinking about who's running the government. But if you're always hungry, all you're thinking about is, where am I going to get my next meal? When's that meal going to come? How am I going to feed my family? You're desperate. You're in survival mode. And a key example of this, and you should look this up, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but it's Holodomor. I'm pronouncing it how it's spelled. Holodomor. Okay? It's said a different way. But Holodomor is an example of a mass famine in Ukraine where something like 1 million people, it might have been more than 1 million people, were killed because they starved. They starved of famine. They were subjected to a famine, a deliberate famine under Stalin. He actually deliberately starved millions of people in the territory that we now know as Ukraine. He starved them to death deliberately so that they were always in that desperate primal state. They could never think to challenge his authority because they're just thinking about where's my next meal. He wanted to weaken the population. So if you look up Holodomor and the Ukraine famine, there's another fantastic example of how governments were limiting individuality by suppressing our desire for freedom through the manipulation or through the deprivation of our most basic needs. So hopefully that answers your question there, Jack, with a few good contextual examples. Now, Horse iOS, when will I read the essays? Well, I've got a couple of examples to go through. I'll go through them in a second. Does anyone have any other questions, preliminary questions about assessments or anything like that? Otherwise, a couple of examples to go through in just a second. Okay, I'll have another look after, but otherwise, let's get into it. Let me give some feedback to some students who have written some answers based on their essay questions or assessment tasks. So they're only small chunks. We're not looking at full essays here. But thanks, Jack. Appreciate it. Oh, you're on Mastermind tomorrow. Fantastic. We'll see you on Mastermind tomorrow evening. It will be fun revision, indeed. And anyone else who's watching this, if you want to come on Jeddel's game show and compete for up to $100, then make sure you look up Jeddel Mastermind on the YouTube channel. Click the link in the description to apply, and you could be on the show in the run-in. But for now, let me share my screen. Hopefully, let's get this working. And I will present. Bear with me. Okay. Hopefully this is working for you. So here we go. Let's have a look at a question here by a student or submitted from a student. The question is, our ability to express ourselves defines the limits of our human experiences. Evaluate this statement in light of your prescribed text, 1984 by George Orwell. Now, if you're watching this and you don't study 1984, that doesn't mean you have to click off this video. It doesn't mean it's irrelevant. I'm actually just going to break down the question in a general sense and then talk about the principles of writing as I go through a sample body paragraph that has been written in response to this question. So let's have a look here. Our ability to express ourselves defines the limits of our human experiences. Evaluate this statement. Okay, we need to make a judgment on this statement. Do we agree? Do we disagree? It's kind of like a to what extent question, very similar in that respect, in that we need to determine how much we agree with this statement. Now, we never actually have to say, I fully agree or it is true, but it needs to be apparent. It needs to be implied from the conviction of your answer, essentially, from the way it's written, from the tone. So let's break down the keywords. As we do always with any question, we identify the key terms and then we quickly try and brainstorm how we could unpack them. Our ability to express ourselves defines the limits of our human experiences. Okay, ability to express ourselves. Now, this is a phrase that I'm going to highlight as one thing, but obviously there are a lot of synonyms or related terms that go with this. You should always prioritize the terms of the question, yes, but because this concept is over 3 or 4 words, we can play with a few different aspects of that. Like our ability to express ourselves, I'm going to say is self-expression. That counts as being an actual word of the question because it has the word express within it. Okay, so we need to be flexible with the words of the question, but not so much in terms of using synonyms, but in terms of using derivative words that are going to prevent us from constantly repeating those exact terms. The more terms there are in a key term, like 4 words here, the harder it is to say something original because you feel like you need to constantly say all of that every time. So self-expression is a nice way to kind of sum up what that's saying. And it's saying our ability to express ourselves, our self-expression, defines the limits of our human experience. It's saying that if we can't express ourselves, then our human experience is completely limited. Okay, so limits of our human experience. So I'll put in limits. Limits is a key word. And like many human experience questions, the word or words human experiences are going to be in there. However, you need to make sure you're constantly addressing what the relevant human experiences are. So in this case, we're really looking at, okay, self-expression. Is that the limit? What are the limits? And what human experiences are we talking about? If we think about self-expression, if we want to quickly unpack that term, then we should think about the different ways that we express ourselves. So self-expression, what type of self-expression? What type? How? How do we express ourselves? Well, that could be obviously physically, behaviorally, but it could also be intellectually, intellectual freedoms. And by the way, words like freedom, autonomy, individuality, agency, it's good to brainstorm what the synonyms are. Even though you should always be prioritizing the actual words of the question, it's still good to do that brainstorming, because then that allows you to have a better understanding of what the question is actually asking. So it is good to create a quick list of synonyms. I'm just saying you should always prioritize the actual words over those synonyms, but I'm not saying you can never use them. Okay, so you can express yourself physically, behaviorally through your actions, but also intellectually, how you think. We could also say a similar term is psychologically. Okay, intellectually is about reasoning things. Psychologically could be things like remember in the past, in the case of Winston. Intellectually, this could be like critical thought, a challenge in the government. Okay, so that's self-expression. And of course, there are others. So this is through your actions, and especially subversive, which means rebellious actions. Excuse me. Okay, so there's your self-expression. Now, it's saying that defines the limits. Well, is that true? What are the limits of our human experience? Do you have much of a human experience if you can't express yourself? Well, you still experience things, I would argue, but it limits the freedom of your human experience. So that's the nuance of the argument, you see. It doesn't just limit it full stop. The question here is inviting you to specify what it limits and what it doesn't limit. Well, I would say, look, it's not going to limit your human experience, but it's certainly going to limit the freedom of your human experience, right? But it does not limit, I'm going to say, the level of oppression you can experience, which is a human experience, is almost infinite. So there are no limits to that. See how there's a nuance now? That's kind of like answering to what extent. We're saying, whilst it limits the freedom of your human experience, and maybe you link that to joy, connection, human connections, it actually can invite an unlimited level of oppression. Okay, because that's how oppression works. So this is all to do with suffering. This is to do with loneliness. This is to do with, excuse me, this is to do with, what are other things? Being manipulation. This is to do with conformity, conforming to what you're told, right? If you conform and do everything that you're told to do and think in the way you're told to think, then you aren't expressing yourself. You're actually giving yourself up. But that doesn't mean that you're limiting the human experience. You're just limiting the good parts of it, you would argue. And that's essentially what I'm saying here. So that's a good way of breaking down that. And then in terms of what those human experiences are, we just talked about a couple. So freedom, yes, limited. Oppression, no, this could be unlimited unless challenged, unless government is challenged. Okay, and that's just a basic way of summarizing the argument. I won't make it any more complex than that. If you could come up with something like that that's nuanced, that actually shows an understanding of the different types of human experiences and that some are going to be limited, but some aren't, then you're going to put yourself in contention for a band 6 or an A grade in terms of that category. Okay, so hopefully that helps in terms of breaking down the question. Okay, that's a really important way to think about it. Identify your key terms, break them down by asking yourself some basic questions such as what type, what are some synonyms here just to help me understand it? What are the different ways that you could express yourself? Is it true that there are limits? Well, what are the limits applying to? Okay, they're applying to your freedom. Sure. What about oppression? Think about positives and negatives without saying the words positives and negatives, but think about it through that lens. And you might actually be able to create a more nuanced answer that's different from everyone else's, who just agree. Everyone just agrees. Yes, it limits it. No, it limits the freedom, but it doesn't limit the oppression. And that's what the novel kind of gets at. Or at least that's one interpretation. I'm just giving you an example. There are many ways to go about it. Let's have a quick look at a body paragraph in response to this question. So remember, the question is, our ability to express ourselves defines the limits of our human experiences. Let's put this question above. We can constantly come back to that. And let's see how well the body paragraph answers it. So when I'm looking at a body paragraph, what I like to do is split it up into sentences. So I'm going to actually kind of enter all of these down, if I can find them, because it allows me to see all of the distinct points, or at least the sentences that are being used, and it makes it easy to cut things out. But it might be the case that a couple of these sentences are meant to pair together. But nonetheless, I'm just having a quick look here. And this gives me a sense of the structure as well by doing this. Like, how many sentences have been written? And I encourage you to all do this yourself. So I'll leave the last sentence and the first sentence without a bullet point. But what I'm going to do is actually bullet point these sentences here. Excuse me. And there we go. Okay, I can see we're dealing with about 1, 2, 3, 4. That looks like a really long sentence, or maybe I missed something. 5, 6, 7. 7 internal sentences in our pedal paragraph here. And we need to simplify that down. No doubt we can shorten that. That's very long. But sometimes you'll flesh out your points over 2 sentences, which is fine, as long as the sentences aren't then too long. You can't have 2 really long sentences to make 1 point. You could have 1 longish sentence to make a point, or 2 shorter sentences to make a point, but it's just going to drag on, and you won't be advancing your argument quickly enough if you're making every sentence really long and you're taking too long to get your point across. Okay, so let's look at the topic sentence here. There's the question. Orwell's brutal world highlights how totalitarian regimes constrain and damage human relationships, limiting authentic human expression. Well, straight away, what I really like about this topic sentence is that it engages with the exact words of the question, but without repeating it. It uses expression, right? Human expression. And it actually defines it in a clever way. It says it limits authentic human expression. So the authentic is a unique touch that the student has added. They've actually told me the type of expression. It's the authentic expression that gets limited. So just like we said before, it's not all human experiences and expression that's limited. It's actually the authentic ones in the case of this student's response. Okay, so fantastic in terms of using the words of the question, but notice the green. You've added that specific point in that wasn't in the question. And it can literally just be one word to unpack it, as you can see there. So well done for that one. It is a little bit repetitive maybe in terms of saying constrained human relationships, limiting human expression, but I think they're different enough. But reading back from the start, Orwell's brutal world, that's fine. Brutal world, I mean, brutal, maybe you could maybe say dystopian if you haven't said that elsewhere. Maybe you have, but just to link it to the genre. Orwell's dystopian world, and you could even be specific here. You don't have to be, but you could say of Oceania. And just to be a little bit more specific, you don't want to be too specific in a topic sentence, but it's okay to be kind of general or generally specific. I was going to say that's a bit of a paradox if you can understand that. It's okay to be specific to a point, but not to where you're literally zooming in on one quote or one aspect of the whole text. Here, we're just saying generally the dystopian world of Oceania. So it's general, but it's still specific about what the world is. Orwell's dystopian world of Oceania highlights how totalitarian regimes constrain and damage. Now, this is that double up problem. If you've watched me do feedback before, you'll know I love to point out, I don't love to do it actually. I don't like to do it because it means it's still happening, but I love to kind of help identify where you might be doubling up on similar terms. Okay, so in this case, the student says constrain and damage human relationships. Well, constraining them, damaging them, they're pretty similar. Maybe you could argue there's a substantial difference. I don't think so, but I think we're just doubling up here to try and be saying more, and we think we're going to get more marks because of that. Actually, if you just pick the best one, it's going to have a lot more bang, right? It's going to have more punch, because the more words you use to describe the human relationships, the less potency or strength each of those terms has. So we want to say highlights how totalitarian regimes constrain human relationships. Doesn't sound that strong. Damage human relationships, yeah, also doesn't sound too strong. And that's the point. When you actually isolate them together, neither of them are perfect. But if you put them together, you can convince yourself that you're saying something that is near perfect. I would probably say destabilize, fragment. I mean, not only one of these, but the point is to pick one that kind of sums up generally what you want to say in terms of that effect. Okay, they destabilize, fragment human relationships. Maybe they stifle. Stifle is another good word. But again, pick one of these words, and there are a bunch of others. I think constrain, damage, maybe not the strongest, because you're then going to say limiting here. Constrain's very similar. So go for that. And then human relationships, limiting authentic expression, maybe self-expression, because it's about, and then you don't repeat the human part. So hopefully that's making sense. A couple of easy fixes, but I like the general gist of the topic sentence. It's very clear and easy to follow, and it clearly links to the question. Now, just checking back on some questions here. Excuse me. No, all good. If you guys have any questions as I go through this, please let me know. But we are just going through a student's response here. It's for 1984, but you can apply the feedback I'm providing to any essay that you're doing. You might be in year 10, you might be in year 11, year 12. Doesn't matter. You can apply these principles to any essay. So let's have a look at the next sentence. So topic sentence, and then the student goes straight into their analysis. Now that's a pretty good structure. Some students choose to do like kind of a second sentence that elaborates further on the topic sentence. I'm only a fan of that if you're a very fast writer and you do those two sentences very concisely, so it doesn't take up too many words. And they have to really serve a purpose. So sometimes you could have a context sentence as the second one and connect it with a more specific aspect of the text. But generally speaking, a safe bet is to go topic sentence, then get into your analysis straight away. So following that petal or peel structure, but weave in the context and weave in links to form throughout this analysis. So let's see if we do that while looking for other things as well. From its dramatic opening sentence, it was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13, a sentence which echoes Eliot's existential modernist nightmare, The Wasteland. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, and ironically subverting Browning's home thoughts from abroad. Oh, to be in England now that April there. Okay, what we have there is some very good intertextual links. The student has linked it to other texts. I mean, Eliot's a little bit earlier, of course, but there's quite some linkage there. Actually, I don't know the exact date on The Wasteland. I'll have to look up The Wasteland. But a lot of Eliot's works is a little bit earlier. But there are these important links there potentially that the student's drawn upon. I wouldn't necessarily go this far as to take out specific quotes from another author's work, especially doing that twice, because that can take up a lot of words. But if it's done correctly, it could be very powerful. And obviously, not a lot of students are going to do this. So I applaud the effort to bring up other contextual influences in terms of writers, right? This is literary context that we're engaging with. So in terms of linking to literary context, I like the link here to two other texts and or authors, but it may be a little bit wordy. That's the only thing I would caution against. 1984 simultaneously accepts the contemporary nightmare and undermines the traditional English bucolic. The traditional English bucolic. Okay, using bucolic, typically an adjective, using it as a noun. Maybe that works. I would think that that is an adjective. So traditional English bucolic, but if that makes sense, I would have to check that, but just be careful with that one. I'll just flag it as a potential issue. Foreshadowing of loss of autonomy. Some grammatical errors here. Foreshadowing of loss of autonomy. Foreshadowing a loss of autonomous human expression. Okay. Of loss. Yeah, I think the double of. Always try and avoid two ofs if you can. Foreshadowing a loss of autonomous human expression. Now, it's good in the sense of those links to context from a literary point of view. But I think you could, after reading it, I think you could connect these two. So like simultaneously accepts the contemporary nightmare. You could say accepts Eliot's modernist nightmare of, and then link the quote in. So here, of, and then of Eliot's, like this is a more subtle, slightly more sophisticated way of doing it, right? Rather than just having these big chunks in the middle of the sentence, you weave it in more subtly, more seamlessly. So 1984 simultaneously accepts the contemporary nightmare of Eliot's existential modernist nightmare. Now, when you say April is the cruelest month, of the dead land, right? You could say Eliot's modernist nightmare of, we'll just say of ourselves and just keep the dead land. Right? And you can then move on to the next thing. So instead of having that whole thing, you can just weave it in here and say, accepts the contemporary nightmare of Eliot. Oh, we don't even need to say that. We would say accepts Eliot's modernist nightmare. Now, I don't know about accepts. You might want it like echoes. Echoes maybe is a better word there. So you definitely want to think about your verb choice there. And instead of saying end, right? Instead of saying end, try and make it one point. So connect those two things. Eliot echoes Eliot's modernist nightmare by undermining. So now it's cause and effect. Try and always think about things in terms of cause and effect, not this and this. It's this causes this, or this is caused by this. Okay, so here, Eliot's modernist nightmare is echoed by this, right? By Orwell doing this, by undermining the traditional English bucolic setting, right? Or framework, or expectations, or paradigm. Maybe you meant a framework there. And then now another cause and effect clause, comma, thereby foreshadowing a loss of autonomous human expression. Okay. I think that's a bit of a leap though, right? Because that's a very broad, sweeping statement. Foreshadowing a loss of autonomous human expression. But all you've said is it undermines the traditional English bucolic. So I think you need a more specific link there. You need to really link to the quote that you've chosen here. You've linked this quote to the literary context, but I don't think what you've said down here has a clear connection with the quote. So you need to look for a more specific link to the words of the quote. That would be my advice there. Otherwise it's too much of a leap. Okay, I can see the undermining of the setting because you're saying it's a cold day, but this perhaps is the bit that needs a bit of work because it's too general. Okay, hopefully that's helpful for you guys watching. Give me some feedback. Am I going too fast? Let me know if what I'm saying is making sense. So let's go through another sentence of analysis that this student has written. And remember, if you want to see examples of sentences of analysis and band 6 examples of things, Jettle.com, if you subscribe to the resources there, we have all of that there for you. We have tons of examples of essay structures, of tables of analysis that have already been formatted in an essay-friendly way. So that's at Jettle.com if you want to check those out for your specific texts that you're studying. Okay, so through his historical allusion, there's our technique. Good to get that analysis, or rather that analytical language in there early. So start with the technique, always an effective way to avoid storytelling and being descriptive. So through his historical allusion to the political terrorism of the Hitler Youth, it was normal for people over 30 to be frightened of their own children. Okay, I like the link. So this is a contextual link. Very good, specific contextual link that this student has used. They've got the technique of historical allusion, and now they've got their quote. It was normal for people over 30 to be frightened of their own children. We talked about this idea before about Big Brother trying to fragment the family unit so that it represents less of a threat to it and so that it can indoctrinate younger generations with its ideology, so it can bring up people who don't even know any other way of thinking. Okay, it's the older generations who represent the greatest threat to Big Brother or to any totalitarian leader, to any dictator, because they know the old way of the world, right? And if you know the old way of the world, you have something to contrast the new world against, which means you can see clear differences and you say, the old world was way better. We were way more free. The new world, we're very oppressed. But if someone has only been grown up in the new world, then they don't know the difference, right? That's why dictators and people who want to control the population, they target the impressionable youth because they don't know any other way. That's why it's dangerous. Now, back to this one. I can see why you've chosen that quote. There's a clear connection to the context you're talking about with Hitler indoctrinating younger generations so that they were effectively spies and they were brainwashed to think like Hitler, essentially. Orwell examines the decline of trust in human relationships. Yes, there's a breakdown of trust and the subversion. So still in that habit of constantly saying end rather than doing cause and effect and just saying one punchy point. So Orwell examines the decline of trust in human relationships. I'd love to see you go deeper on it, but it feels like you make that point and, now you're going to make a second point. I'd love to just see you go deeper on that one point. And maybe you can using what you've got here, but it doesn't sound like it. You're not framing it right because you're using end too much. And the subversion of innocence in the common child. Isn't the decline of trust in human relationships through? Isn't it through? Notice how we're just making a subtle change here like we did with by before. And just by using the word through, now it sounds like, okay, there's a decline of trust because of, there's the cause and effect, the subversion of innocence in the common child, juxtaposing traditional romantic values of familial connection. Good. Okay, I like the point. I like the point overall. That's a good sentence. There are lots of quotes to support that, of course, and maybe you could pepper in some other quotes within that sentence. So sometimes you can use a secondary quote that's not your primary quote with the technique in it, but maybe you could find other quotes. They might only be one-word quotes that can just flow into your explanation here. And that's going to lift the sophistication of the sentence overall because you're engaging more with the text and you're showing you really have a control and a good understanding of the text. Okay? So try and engage with quotes outside of providing evidence for a technique. Okay? So yes, there's your historical illusion. See if you can find some other good one-word or two-word quotes that you can kind of weave into this part of the sentence. Okay? Maybe it's just literally a word that replaces a word you have here. Okay? I'm sure you'll be able to find something in the text. Okay. The other thing that you could improve on is by working on the transition from your technique or your evidence here, right, into the quote. So you bring in the illusion here, then you do a comma, and then you bring in the quote. So your quote isn't flow in. It's not flow in. The way to make it flow is to add in a couple of words. Sometimes it's one word, and to manipulate things so that it reads like a normal sentence. So let's have a look here. And guys, just to be clear, this is a body paragraph, not an introduction. That's why we're looking at this one. It's not an introduction. That's why you're seeing quotes all throughout. Okay? This is a body paragraph, not an introduction. That's why there's all this analysis. Now, here, through his historical allusion to the political terrorism of the Hitler Youth, it was normal for people over 30 to be frightened of their own children. Now, depends who's saying that. We know that it's a third-person narrator, but it's limited in the sense that it biases Winston's point of view. But you need to be clear here on who's speaking, and that way that can help you kind of contextualize this more. So through his historical allusion to the political terrorism of the Hitler Youth, are you saying that Orwell's saying it? It was normal for people over 30 to be frightened of their own children. Through the, sometimes you can do the, because otherwise it sounds like you're going to say, Orwell is saying it, but actually it's the narrator, which isn't necessarily Orwell himself. Of course, I think his voice is truly reflected through the text, through Winston, through the narration, but just be careful with the wording there. So I'm going to change his to the, through the historical allusion to the political terrorism of the Hitler Youth, right? The novels or the narrators. Again, it might be Winston saying this. I can't remember exactly where this quote comes from. It was normal for people, or sometimes you can avoid even saying the narrator. You could just say the observation or the assertion that, right? The observation that, notice the word that here. It helps transition what we're saying about the technique into the quote. So the observation that it was normal for people over 30 to be frightened of their own children, right? And then you don't have to say examines. You can get rid of this, all examines, and just say reflects or represents or highlights a new verb that you haven't already used. So through the historical allusion to the political terrorism of the Hitler Youth, the observation that it was normal for people, see how the observation that it was normal, see how it flows like a normal sentence. I didn't have to pause right before the quote because there was a comma. So just by manipulating the wording a little bit there and really using the word that a lot of the time when you say by alleging that or by observing that or the observation that will help you achieve that flow into the quote. Okay, so that's another important thing to be mindful of, is to get that transition happening there. Okay, now on to the next one. When the child loses its capacity for innocence and expression, so do we all. I get what you're trying to do there. Nice kind of punchy conceptual statement, but it doesn't quite flow right at the end there. But I do like, it's kind of like a summary sentence of this concept. I would say it's connected to that point. When the child loses its capacity for innocence and expression. Look at that. Cheeky little double up again. We need to avoid that. Just say one word. It has more impact. When the child loses its capacity for innocence, for free expression. Why don't we say that? Because that's kind of like innocence, right? When the child loses its capacity for free expression, so do we all. I don't know about so do we all. It has this dramatic intent behind it. I like that. When the child loses its capacity for free expression, we all do, I suppose is what you're saying. So do we all. Maybe that is right. So does everyone, I suppose is what you're trying to say. When the child loses its capacity for free expression, so does everyone else. I mean, yeah, I get what you're saying. That doesn't even sound good. I'm trying to work with that structure. When the child loses its capacity for free expression, so does the wider collective or the broader collective. How about that? Collective's good as well because of collective human experience. When the child loses its capacity for free expression, so does the broader collective, rather than so do we all, because it just sounded a little bit funny there. But I like the intent. So that is really like a punchy finisher on that concept there. Okay, you then say this is furthered by. Now, here's the issue. Here's the issue with this quote, okay? Or with this phrasing. This is furthered by sounds like you're about to repeat yourself. It sounds like you're about to provide another example of the same point, which, judging by the example, imagery of the Parsons children, that's again about the child and destruction of innocence. Sounds like you are going to make the same point, which you shouldn't be. You need to move on to the next point. You need to advance your argument. Don't give us multiple examples of the same point. So this is furthered by, it's the same as saying similarly. You know, similarly might even be worse. But if you're comparing two texts, similarly might be good, or similarly could work in a certain context, but not if you're bringing in another point or another example to prove the same point, okay? So be very wary of this phrasing. It can work sometimes, but here I could just tell reading that you're about to bring in a very similar point. Maybe you add some new points within this broader point, but you need to be careful not to repeat yourself. So this is furthered by the frightening imagery of the Parsons children, a calculating ferocity. Again, like you need to work on that flow, like I just showed you before. avoid that comma before every quote. Try and get that seamless transition, and your writing is going to have a lot more flair and it's going to flow and sound more sophisticated. So you get bonus points when it comes to written expression, which is one of the three main categories that you're assessed on. Written expression, answering the question, use of evidence. They're the three big categories. You need to make sure you are satisfying all of them to the highest potential, to your highest potential, okay? All right, so you've got the quote, which paradoxically represents the child's instinctual function, traditionally symbolic of innocence. See, the innocence point, innocence, it's a similar point. It's too similar for my liking. So I would be wary of including this at all. As violent and subservient, servient to the state's control, suggesting, by the way, notice how many commas are in here already. Be very careful with using too many commas. This could indicate that you either need to split the sentence up into two, or you just need to cut some parts out, merge some parts together, and say what you want to say in less words, which will just require you to keep reading over the sentence out loud and cut it down. Because if there are too many clauses, we will lose sight of what you're actually trying to say, because we get caught up with all of these little sections of the sentence and it becomes very hard to piece it together. Keep it simple. Try not to have more than two main commas in terms of articulating your point, okay? As violent and subservient, suggesting that the totalitarian state has replaced the family unit with Big Brother, and therefore, now the and therefore is okay. It's just when you have and, because that's still cause and effect. And therefore, that's cause and effect. And therefore, authentic expression ceases to exist. Loyalty is not to your father or mother, but to the father figure, Stalin or Hitler. Okay, like again, going for that short, punchy finisher, but I think you could say all of this. Maybe you could still have the punchy finisher, but I just don't think you need all of this, right, to say this point. I also don't think you should include the point anyway, because you've already made it here. So perhaps to strengthen all of this, you combine two techniques. You say, through the historical allusion to the political terrorism of the Hitler Youth, coupled with, right, in the observation that it was done for people to, maybe you can couple that with, I'm not saying it will work here, this is just an idea, maybe it's an idea for some others watching it, where you might be able to do it, coupled with the frightening / barbaric / animalistic imagery of the Parsons children with those eyes, right? Reflects the decline of trust or breakdown of trust in the family unit, right? And you can change that to family unit. So this is an example of going through a response, editing it, and actually looking to merge things. Not everything has to be siloed off, okay? Like, oh, we can only edit this one point. No, now I'm thinking, after reading the first point, that maybe we just combine it here and have two techniques, and we say coupled with the imagery of that, and then we can just leave this one point because they were both saying the same point anyway. Perfect. That's going to save us so many words. So we can basically get rid of all that, merge the technique up here, make the one strong point, and move on to the next new point. Okay? All right. I'm only going to spend a few more minutes on this, and then we'll wrap up. So if I didn't get to yours, by the way, I think there's another one or two. There should be a form. Go and check out our other Q&A live streams. There should be a link in the description where you can submit a response for me to provide feedback. So go and do that after you watch this video if you're interested in getting feedback, or go to jedl.com. And if you subscribe, we will let you know whenever we run these, and you'll get access to all of our best resources as well. But just to wrap up here, additionally, should be a comma, Orwell's aesthetic use of the traditional English children's nursery rhythm, I guess rhyme you mean? Oranges and lemons say the bells of St. Clement's. To prefigure the death of Winston Smith, here comes a chopper to chop off your head, underlines the rejection of aesthetic expression. Now, careful with the double up there. We don't really want to repeat words like that if we can avoid it, unless they are one of the key words of the question. Okay, so just be careful of that. I like the word aesthetic. That's how something looks. That's to do with the form. right? Rejection of aesthetic expression by the state to suggest the reinvention of the child's image from innocence and autonomy. There we go. Double up effect, double up galore in this response, like a lot of them, to brutality and loyalty to Big Brother. Just too many ends. Just pick one for each of those parts, and it's going to sound a lot punchier and a lot more sophisticated, okay? Try to not keep repeating the same points about innocence and innocence and innocence. You've already made that. Yes, you can refer to innocence again, but maybe you would use a synonym in that case. It's not a synonym for the actual word of the question. It's just a synonym for that concept or conceptual term that you seem to like here. So look for a synonym there, or use a different word, and just pick one in that pair and then pick one in that pair, okay? And again, I think you meant to say rhyme here. Indeed, the nursery rhyme, a connection between our world and Orwell's world, reminds us of our own rejection of traditional familial values and brutalization of children. Again, through the brutalization, is it cause and effect instead of end, okay? That's such a simple thing that is going to lead to a huge benefit for all of you. If you can all just cut down the amount of times that you're saying end and listing things, and instead frame things from a cause and effect point of view, then your writing is going to be a lot punchier and more sophisticated and clearer, right? It's just easy to follow if you say one thing at a time and how one thing causes another thing. Simple. Now, be careful. You've talked about a nursery rhyme and then you talk about it again. So you're probably dwelling on it for too long. If you're going to go on about it again here, you probably need to bring in another point and another piece of evidence, okay? You need either merge with previous. This is what I would say to this one. Either merge with previous sentence, eliminate, or eliminate's pretty strong, isn't it? Remove or delete, or find another piece of evidence that can support a slightly different point. Slightly different point, so you don't repeat yourself. Okay? So that would be the feedback that I would provide for a sentence like that. Finally, clearly in Orwell's world, authentic human relationships are something of the past, before the revolution. See how you've used a quote there, just integrated it in? It's not because you're trying to use a technique, you've actually worked it into your sentence. That's what I'm talking about. You should do more of that with your other sentences of analysis where you already have used another quote. Now, this sentence is too much like a link sentence. So you've got a link sentence here, but this is also a bit of a summary sentence. So pick one there, and that's going to free up room for more analysis in your actual body paragraph. So pick one of these last two sentences, or merge, and free up room for another sentence of analysis with a new point, maybe the one we were just talking about. Okay, so that is my overall structural guidance for a body paragraph that looks like this. Okay, there's a body paragraph. You can see all of the key elements that I was focusing on. If this student has another crack at it, maybe I can give even more specific feedback and rework some of the parts. But I just wanted to give you all an overview, an insight into how I would restructure a lot of these pieces. What sentences are valuable? What sentences are not so valuable? Just there, you can see at the very end, you don't need two sentences back to back in that situation. Focus more on bringing in a new technique with a new point, and maybe it links to another aspect of context. Maybe it links to an aspect of the form as a whole, like the fact that this is a satire or a dystopian, okay, that it has futuristic elements or speculative elements, okay? Make sure you use your sentences wisely and don't waste them and don't repeat yourself, okay? So dot point through all of your body paragraph sentences, do what I just did and see what's necessary, see if you need to merge things together, and hopefully your write-in will become a lot stronger. So thank you very much for joining in this Q&A. I think there's another response that I'll get to in another stream, but for anyone else who wants help with their work, make sure, again, no worries, Luke, if that was yours, fantastic stuff. You're definitely on the right track there. There's some really strong elements to it conceptually. Just need to simplify some of those parts, remove some of those repetitions. But yes, for anyone else who is keen, make sure you check out the link. I think it'll be in the description below this video on YouTube or another. And you can check it out, premium resources, jettle.com. That's where our best stuff is. And yeah, there's more coming soon. There's a whole new feedback realm coming soon where you can get quick feedback on the spot from the community, from people like myself through our Jettle platform. So just subscribe. You can even make a free account to start with. Subscribe so you're notified of when that will become available, and you can get on the spot feedback for all of your work. So if that sounds cool, go to jettle.com, sign up. You can make a free account, or you can subscribe to our resources as well. Until then, join in for the mastermind. I mean, go look up Jettle Mastermind, apply if you want to be on the show. Otherwise, just enjoy some of the other videos. Thanks very much for joining. Glad I got this done. I had an overnight flight last night, so I still managed to sleep, but I'm glad I got this in. Still had the energy. Thanks for joining, making it possible. I'll see you guys soon, and good luck with your assessments as you wrap up the year. Look forward to seeing you all soon. And Luke, send me an email. If that was your response, I'll shoot you across that feedback that I just made. No worries. See you guys.